Chronicles of Narnia: The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 13, How the Dwarfs Refused to be Taken In. Trinian had thought, or he would have thought if he had time to think at all, that they were inside a little trenched stable, but about 12 feet long and 6 feet wide. In reality they stood on grass. The deep blue sky was overhead, and the air which blew gently on their faces of that day was in the early summer. Not far away from them grew a rose grove of trees, thickly leaved, but under every leaf there peeped out the gold of faint yellow or purple of glowing red fruits, such as no one has ever seen in our world. The fruit made Trinian feel that it must be autumn, but there was something in the feel of the air that told him it not be later than June. They all moved towards the trees. Everyone raised his hand to pick the fruit he best liked the look of, and everyone paused for a second. This fruit was so beautiful that each felt it can't be meant for me. Surely we're not allowed to pluck it. It's all right, said Peter. I know that we're all thinking, but I'm quite sure we needn't. I have a feeling we've got to the country where everything is allowed. Here goes then, said Eustace, and they all began to eat. Well, what's the fruit like? Unfortunately, no one can describe a taste. All I can say is, compared to those fruits, the freshest grapefruit you've ever eaten was dull, and the juiciest orange was dry, and the most melting pear was hard and woolly, and the sweetest wild strawberry was sour, and there were no seeds or stones and no wasps. If you had once eaten that fruit, all the nicest things in this world would taste like medicines after that, but I can't describe it. You can't find out what it's like unless you get to that country and taste it for yourself. When they had eaten enough, Eustace said to King Peter, You haven't yet told us how you got here. You were just going to, when King Trinian turned up. There's not much to tell, said Peter. Edmund and I were standing on the platform when we saw your train coming in. I remember thinking it was the bend far too fast, and then I remember thinking how funny it was that our people were probably in the same train, though Lucy didn't know about it. Your people, High King? Said Trinian. I mean my father and my mother. Edmund and Lucy's had mine. Where were they? asked Joel. You don't mean to say they know about Narnia? Oh, no, it had nothing to do with Narnia. They were on their way to Bristol, and I'd only heard they were going to that morning, but Edmund said they'll be bound to be going by that train. Edmund was the sort of person who knows about railways. What happened then? Said Joel. Well, it's not easy to describe, is it, Edmund? Said the High King. Not very, said Edmund. It wasn't at all like that other time when we pulled out of our own world by magic. There was a frightful roar and something hit me with a bang, but it didn't hurt, and I felt so much scared excited. Oh, and this is one queer thing. I'd had a rather sore knee from a hack at Rugger. I noticed it had suddenly gone, and I felt very light. And then here we were. It was much the same for us in the railway carriage, said the Lord Diggory, wiping the last traces of the fruit from his golden beard. Only I think you and I, Polly, chiefly felt that we've been unstiffened. You youngsters won't understand, but we stopped feeling old. Youngsters indeed, said Joel. I don't believe you two are really much older than we are. Well, if we weren't, we had been, said the Lady Polly. And what has been happening to you since you got here? Asked Eustace. Well, said Peter, for a long time, at least I suppose it was a long time, nothing happened. Then the door opened. The door? Said Trinian. Yes, said Peter, the door you came in, or out by. Have you forgotten? But where is it? Look, said Peter and pointed. Trinian looked and saw the queerest, most ridiculous thing you can imagine. Only a few yards away, clear to be seen in the sunlight, there stood up a rough wooden door and around it the framework of a doorway. Nothing else, no walls, no roof. He walked towards it bewildered, and the others followed, watching to see what he would do. He walked around to the side of the door, but it looked just the same from the other side. He was still in the open air on a summer morning. The door was simply standing up by itself, as it had grown there like a tree. Fair sir, said Trinity the High King, this is a great marvel. It is the door you came through with that Calamine 5 minutes ago, said Peter, smiling. But I did not come out of the wood into the stable, whereas it seems to be a door leading from nowhere to nowhere. It looks like that if you walk around it, said Peter, but if you put your eye to the place where there's a crack between two of the planks and look through. Trinian put his eyes to the hole. At first he could see nothing but blackness. Then his eyes grew used to it. He saw the dull red glow of a bonfire that was nearly going out, and above that, in a black sky, stars. Then he could see dark figures moving about or standing between him and the fire. He could hear them talking, and their voices were those of Calamine's, so he knew that he was looking through the stable door into the darkness of Lantern Waste, where he had fought his last battle. The men were discussing whether to go in and look for Ishtar Khan, but none of them wanted to do that, or to set fire to the stable. He looked round again and could hardly believe his eyes. There was blue sky overhead, and grassy country spreading as far as he could see in every direction, and new friends were all around him laughing. It seems then, said Trinian, smiling to himself, that the stable seen from within and the stable seen from without are two different places. Yes, said the Lord Diggory. It's inside bigger than outside. Yes, said Queen Lucy. In our world, too, as there will once been something inside that was bigger than our whole world. It was the first time she had spoken, and from the thrill in her voice, Trinian knew why. She was drinking everything and even more deeply than the others. She had been too happy to speak. He wanted to hear again, so he did. Of your courtesy, madam, tell on. Tell me your whole adventure. After the shock and the noise, said Lucy, we found ourselves here, and we wondered at the door as you did. Then the door opened for the first time, and we saw darkness through the doorway when it did. And there came through a big man with a naked sword. We saw by his arms that he was a Calamine. He took his head beside the door with the sword raised, resting on his shoulder, ready to cut down anyone who came through. We went to him and spoke to him, but we thought he would neither see nor hear us. And he never looked around on the sky and the sunlight and the grass. I think he wouldn't see them either. So then we waited a long time. But when we heard the bolt being drawn from the other side of the door, but the man didn't get ready to strike with his sword till he could see who was coming in. So we suppose he had been told to strike and spare others. But at the very moment the door opened, all of a sudden Tush was there, on the other side of the door, and none of us saw where he came from. And though the door was there came a big cat. It gave one look at Tush and ran for its life, just in time, for he pounced at it and the door hit his beak as it was shut. The man could see Tush. He turned very pale and bowed down before the monster, but it vanished away. Then we waited a long time again. At last the door opened a third time, and there came a young Calamine. I liked him. The senator at the door stared and looked very surprised when he saw him. I think he'd been expecting someone quite different. I see it all now, said Eustace. He had had the bad habit of interrupting stories. The cat was to go in first, and the sentry had orders to do him no harm. Then the cat was to come out and say he had seen the beastly Tush Lan and pretend to be frightened as to scare the other animals. Well, what Shift never guessed was that the real Tush would turn up, so Ginger came out really frightened, and after that Shift would send in anyone he wanted to get rid of, and the sentry would kill them. And, friend, said Trinian softly, you hindered the lady in her tale. Well, said Lucy, the sentry was surprised. It gave the other man just the time to get on guard. They had a fight. He killed the sentry and flung him outside the door. Then he came walking slowly forward where we were. He could see us and everything else. We tried to talk to him, but he was rather like a man in a trance. He kept on saying, Tush, Tush, where is Tush? I go to Tush. So he gave it up and he went away somewhere, over there. I liked him. And after that, ugh! Lucy made a face. After that, said Edmund. Someone flung a monkey through the door, and Tush was there again. My sister is so tender-hearted she doesn't like to tell you that Tush made one peck and the monkey was gone. Serve him right, said Eustace. All the same, I hope he'll disagree with Tush too. And after that, said Edmund, came about a dozen dwarfs, and then Joel and Eustace, and all of yourself. I hope Tush ate the dwarfs too, said Eustace. Little swine. No, he didn't, said Lucy. And don't be horrid. They're still here. In fact, you can see them from here. I tried to make friends with them, but it's no use. Friends with them? Said Eustace. If you knew how those dwarfs had been behaving. Stop it, Eustace, said Lucy. Do come and see them. King Trinian, perhaps you could do something with them. I can feel no great love for dwarfs today, said Trinian. Yet at your asking, lady, I would do a greater thing than this. Lucy led the way, and soon they could all see the dwarfs. They had a very odd look. They weren't scrolling about or enjoying themselves, although the cords which they had been tied seemed to have vanished, nor were they lying down and having a rest. They were sitting very close together in a little circle facing one another. They never looked round or took any notice of the humans till Lucy and Trinian were almost near enough to touch them. Then the dwarfs all cocked their heads if they couldn't see anyone, but were listening hard and trying to guess by the sound what was happening. Look out, said one of them in a shorty voice. Mind where you're going. Don't walk into our faces. Oh, right, said Eustace dignantly. We're not blind. We've got eyes in our heads. They must be darn good ones if you can see and hear, said the same dwarf whose name was Diggle. In where? Said Edmund. Why, you bonehead, in here, of course, said Diggle. In this pitch-black, poky, smelly little hole of a stable. Are you blind? Said Trinian. Ain't we all blind in the dark? Said Diggle. But it isn't dark, you poor stupid dwarfs, said Lucy. Can't you see? Look up, look around. Can't you see the sky and the trees and the flowers? Can't you see me? How in the name of all humbug can I see what it ain't there? How can I see any more than you can see me on this pitch darkness? But I can see you, said Lucy. I'll prove I can see you. You've got a pipe in your mouth. Anyone that knows the smell of Bassie could do that, said Diggle. Ah, the poor things, this is dreadful, said Lucy. She had an idea. She stopped and picked some wild violets. Listen, dwarf, she said. Even if your eyes are wrong, perhaps your nose is all right. Can you smell that? She leaned across and held the fresh, damp flowers to Diggle's ugly nose, but she had to jump back quietly in order to avoid a blow from his hard little fist. None of that, he shouted. How dare you? What do you mean by shoving a lot of filthy stable litter in my face? There was a thistle in it too. It's like your sauce. And who are you anyway? Earthman, said Trinian. She is the Queen Lucy, sent hither by Aslan out of the deep past, and it is for her sake alone that I, Trinian, your lawful king, do not cut all your heads from your shoulders, prove and twice proved traitors that you are. Well, if that doesn't beat anything, exclaimed Diggle, how can you go on talking your rot? Your wonderful line that didn't come and help you, did he? Thought not. And now, even now, you have been beaten and shoved into this black hole just the same as the rest of us, and you're still at your old game, starting a new lie, trying to make us believe that that none of us shut up until it ain't dark. Heaven knows what. There is no black hole. Save it in your own fancy, fool, cried Trinian. Come out of it. And leaning forward, he caught Diggle by the belt and hood and swung him right out of the circle of dwarfs. But the moment Trinian put him down, Diggle started back to his place among the others, rubbing his nose and yelling, Ow! Ow! What'd you do that for? Banging my face against the wall? You nearly broken my nose. Oh dear, said Lucy. What are we to do for them? Let him alone, said Eustace. But as he spoke, the earth trembled. The sweet air grew suddenly sweeter. Brightness flashed behind them. All turned. Trinian turned last because he was afraid. There stood Aslan's Desire, a huge, real golden lion, Aslan himself, and already the others were kneeling in a circle round his forepaws and burrowing their hands and faces in his mane as he stooped and his great head to touch them with his tongue. Then he fixed his eyes upon Trinian, and Trinian came near, trembling, and flung himself at the lion's feet. The lion kissed him and said, Well done, last kings of Narnia, who stood firm at the darkest hour. Aslan, said Lucy through her tears, will you do something for these poor dwarfs? Dearest, said Aslan, I will show you both what I can and what I cannot do. He came close to the dwarfs and gave a low growl, low but it set all the air shaking, and the dwarfs said to one another, Hear that? That's the gang at the other end of the stable, trying to frighten us. They do it with a machine of some kind. Don't take any notice. They won't take us in again. Aslan raised his head and shook his mane. Instantly a glorious feast appeared on the dwarfs' knees. Pies and tongues and pigeons and trifles and ices, and each dwarf had a goblet of good wine in his right hand. But it wasn't much use. They began eating and drinking greedily enough, but it was clear that they didn't taste properly. They thought they were eating and drinking only the sort of things you might find in a stable. One said he was trying to eat hay, and the other said he was a bitten old turnip, and the third said he found a raw cabbage leaf. And they raised golden goblets of rich red wine to their lips and said, Ugh, fancy drinking dirty water of a trough that the donkey's been at. Never thought we'd come to this. But very soon every dwarf had been suspecting that every other dwarf had found something nicer than he had, and started grabbing and snatching, and went on quarrelling, till in a few minutes there was a free fight, and all good food was smeared on their faces, and clothed and trodden underfoot. But when at least they sat down to nurse their black eyes and their bleeding noses, they all said, Well, at any rate, there's no humbug here. We haven't let anyone take us in. Dwarfs are for the dwarfs. You see, said Aslan, they will not let us help them. They have chosen cunning instead of belief. The prison is there in their own minds, and they are in that prison. They are so afraid of being taken in, they cannot be taken out. But come, children, I have other work to do. He went to the door, and they all followed him. He raised his head and roared, Now it is time! Then louder, Time! Then so loud that it could have shaken the stars. Time! The door flew open.